The only religious opinion I feel sure of is this: self-awareness is not just a bunch of amino acids bumping together. Robert Heinlein.
And if you look at 2008 and 2009, the financial crisis, it was really created by what the Fed put into effect after the dot-com bubble burst. So again, it's these policies that the Fed does that's trying to keep everything easy keel and just going steady forward and everything perfect. The problem is no economy is supposed to be like that. You have cycles, right? You have booms and busts and booms and busts. When you don't allow for the busts, what does it do? The balloon fills bigger and bigger and bigger with water until it just bursts. And that's the worry here, is that ultimately that's where we're headed, to some massive crisis where the Fed will be the scapegoat. The politicians will make sure of it, even though arguably they should be partially blamed too, but they'll put it on the Fed. I believe from the dust, you'll have a demand from the public that will say, we need rules in place where the government can't just endlessly run up debt, which, by the way, future generations have to repay. And you just can't have a Federal Reserve that's willing to just inject billions, trillions of dollars into the system. There will be restrictions. And I think that will breed some sort of digitized dollar that has restrictions. I've even dealt with the chance that you might have a mass kind of forgiving of debt around the world, because again, we know that we're not the only country with this issue. So you wonder if you'll just have this mass reset, and then from the depths of that will come this kind of new order when it comes to currencies. And I think crypto is kind of setting the table. I don't think Bitcoin is going to be that currency, but I think there will either be a US currency or it will be a kind of a joint world currency that will come from that, where maybe, the UK and Europe and the US and maybe Japan all join together. I don't know if China will join in there, but I do think that that's probably on the horizon. So yeah, it's such a crazy time. I do worry about my kids and what they're going to have to endure in the future, for sure. And by the way, with climate change too, all these things.
Sure. Yeah, there's
reckless monetary policy is setting up for a paradigm shift. It is full throttle ahead with devastating consequences. The dollar is the world reserve currency. What happens when the Fed loses credibility? Trust needs to be restored on a global level. What better way than to restore trust with a trustless system, with monetary policy baked into the code? A global reset and a new world emerges. From the ashes of the old, a level playing field without reserve currencies.
Jim, is your ICE 9 predictions still in play, or are we past that?
No, it's still in play. And just I'll be really brief. ICE 9 is, I nicked it from Kurt Vonnegut, who used it in his novel Cat's Cradle, which I highly recommend. Hilarious. It's a black comedy in the early 60s, at a time when we were all worried about the world being blown up by nuclear weapons. But the idea was that a physicist invented ICE 9, which is an isotope of water, and it's frozen at what we call room temperature. But if a molecule of ice 9 comes in contact with a molecule of water, the water turns to ice 9. So if you poured a vial into a stream, the stream would freeze, the sound would freeze, the ocean would freeze, the world would freeze, and life on Earth would come to an end. So that's what ice 9 is. But I took that idea and applied it to financial markets and said, you can't shut down one market because, FDR had a bank holiday in 1933, but people don't remember that. He shut every bank in America by executive order. Every bank in America by executive order shut, and didn't say when he was going to reopen them. They were reopened about a week later, but he didn't say that at the time. But the point is, if you freeze money market funds, you say, okay, we've got to run on money market funds. Nobody can redeem money market funds until further notice. And you can do that. Then they're going to go to the banks. They're going to give me my money out of the bank. Well, they're going to have to freeze withdrawals from deposits. Then they're going to go to stocks and sell stocks because people want the cash. And they're going to have to shut the stock market. So the point is, you can't freeze one section of the markets without freezing all of them, because investors will just pivot from one to the other to the next, the same way the ice 9 molecule, until you have to shut down everything. And I talked about this in chapter 1 of my book, The Road to Ruin, 2016, how the biggest cog in the wheel, if you will, is BlackRock. And BlackRock's not a bank. And it barely avoided being regulated as a systemically important financial institution coming out of Dodd-Frank. But don't think that the lobbying associated with that wasn't, taken to an unheard of level. Larry Fink gets touted as Secretary of the Treasury, but rest assured that if you get into the kind of scenario we just described, that there'll be a phone call to BlackRock and say, you've got to freeze everybody.
The whole system comes to a stop. It freezes. The crypto in my ledger is money that can be sent to anyone in the world in seconds at a fraction of a penny. The banks will reach a moment where they can't transact, and the technology that they have tried to contain will be the saving grace. It will be a fight or flight moment. Will they save themselves by using crypto?
Thanks. And the last one I make about regulation is, and you alluded to this, David, is regulation can also be used as a barrier to entry by the regulated companies. And every time I see a CEO of a major financial services company denouncing Bitcoin as a fraud, it strikes me that that's just an attempt to keep a regulatory moat kind of around their organization. In the world of moving money around the world, so in the world of trading in stocks, in the last 20 years, the price of trading in stocks has been reduced by 99.5%. It's literally 0.5% of what it was 20 years ago. The world of moving money around the world, credit card payments, remittances, foreign exchange transactions, payday loans, et cetera, has gone up during that same time period. And the companies that are in those segments want desperately to keep those prices high, and they will use regulatory barriers to entry and obfuscation to protect themselves. And we should just be alert to that.
Thank you.
The large banks have a monopoly on moving money. When we hear things like Bitcoin is a fraud or crypto is only used for money laundering, it's to protect the monopoly. Technology is deflationary. The cost of trading stocks is 1/100th of what it used to be. The same can happen for cross-border payments today with technology like XRP. RippleNet is integrated into payment hub after payment hub. Earthport, Finastra, Temenos, TCS Banks, ECS Fin. When the time comes, Ripple is integrated into the foundation of the payment systems. The tech is contained, but when push comes to shove, it's at their fingertips through a Ripple API.
It allows for much more enhanced monitoring and visibility over a financial system. It can bode for a much more efficient economy and marketplace. It creates a much superior payment ecosystem. And I think those are some of the key areas that central banks are really starting to drive home right now. But then more specifically, the understanding that these types of technologies are actually bringing prosperity and economic growth to the citizenry and to the corporations. And while it's a central bank's job to ensure the stability and trust of the dollar and the economy is there, it's part of the mandate as well to ensure economic stimulation occurs. And one of the key things that we're seeing is that central banks are beginning to realize that it's actually in their best interest to begin supporting these types of technologies.
The central banks are printing because they are trying to prevent a recession from occurring. While issuing debt, the financial assets boom in price while the real economy slows. If the financial assets drop, it will have a ripple effect in the real economy. This is a redistribution of wealth. The lower class pays through inflation while the rich, those that hold assets, benefit directly from money printing. Crypto is a way to stimulate the real economy without pumping financial assets. With tokenization, more efficient payment rails, the cost of doing business significantly drops as well as the speed picks up. It also opens new opportunities for new companies that can offer new jobs.
But it's really becoming an increasingly realistic hypothetical. Let's imagine you're an exporter to China. It can be cotton, could be beef, could be anything down from Australia. You've got a great Chinese client who takes, say, 30, 40, 50% of your output, maybe 90 in some industries. And they say to you one day, look, we love your product, it's great, we want to sign a new 10-year agreement with you, so you're guaranteed you can keep selling it to us at a premium price too. We're going to pay you in renminbi, not in US dollars from now on, and it's going to be in digital renminbi, so it won't be coming through your bank. You download this app on your phone, and the currency will just show up on your phone. Now, the problem is that digital renminbi is not going to be exchangeable for Aussie dollars, because it's not going to be through the banking system, it's going to be on your phone. It will effectively be the equivalent of a widget, or some kind of a cryptocurrency, if you will, but of Chinese origin. And it will be fantastic if you want to buy stuff in China. So you sell to them, you've got these tokens which are effectively only exchangeable in the Chinese shop, and off you can go back to China and order over the internet and get everything sent back to you in Australia. So provided you're prepared to do that, Bob's your uncle. You've got your supply chain sorted out for as far as the eye can see. But the geopolitical ramifications of that are you're moving away from using the US dollar, and more of your earnings are in a currency you can only use with China or with a very small subset of countries. Now, we're not there yet. We are heading closer and closer towards a point where that decision may have to be made. And I'm not even sure if actual individual exporters will be in a position to make it, because it could well be that regulators will turn around and say, we're not going to allow that because we can see where that leads in 5 or 10 years and we don't like it. And were that to happen, then your contract dries up overnight. So hypothetical, but it's not unrealistic.
Imagine a world where every nation has tokenized fiat. Currencies would be competing globally. The governments will intervene to prevent economies from using other nations' currencies. The government of Australia will not allow their citizens to ditch the Aussie dollar to use the digital yuan. This is where a bridge asset comes into play. China sends the digital yuan and it converts into the Aussie dollar. Conversion will be mandatory into this new age.
The entire industrial supply chain that we currently have globally will be rewritten. If everyone's going to shift from dirty production to green production and green electricity, we need a whole new different set of minerals rather than coal and gas and oil. We need lithium. We need, well, if we're going to go nuclear, you need uranium. You need cobalt if you're going to be going that particular route. So where these are located is one issue. The supply chains to get them somewhere else is another issue. And then who controls the supply chains and the global value chain within that new order is what's at stake. Right now, pretty much everything is made in China, some in Japan, some in Europe, not much left in the US, but it's not green. When we shift to green, every country from America to Europe to the UK to Japan to China, they're all putting their flag in the ground and saying we are going to be the ones who build the really juicy, expensive, high-end elements of the supply chain. For example, we're going to be building the cars and the car batteries. Fine. But if everyone's going to be doing it, either we deglobalize, which is not something people want to think about, but that's the implication, or we're going to have big winners and losers. So, for example, if America can start making green cars with cobalt, if it can source cobalt and lithium and automate everything and make it in America, who's going to miss out? China. Their economy will be smashed by that. Or if China's going to do it, America can't decouple from China. They can have as much tension as they want, but if they want to meet their green targets, they'll have to buy everything from China. So effectively, what we're already seeing is the beginning of a more 19th century style world where everyone's looking for resources, which they don't have, trying to set up supply chains to make sure they get home, and trying to use protectionism and tariffs and subsidies and build back better to say, yep, all those jobs are going to come home to us. And that involves a government that really understands how to think strategically, think in 3 dimensions, not just say, you don't get rich by trading with yourself, which is absolute nonsense, but every Aussie politician says it over and over again, and actually has a vision for where you go from here in a fast-changing world where there are a lot of sharp elbows. And if you don't have them, you're going to get elbowed.
The petrodollar is a standard where every drop of oil that is pumped out of the ground is priced in dollars. We're entering the 4th industrial revolution where oil and coal is being phased out, therefore less demand for dollars. Let's put this in perspective. The US has a record amount of debt to GDP. We have abused confidence with sanctions and secondary sanctions. At the same time, a shift towards green energy. Nations will update their currency and the petrodollar standard fades away. A new technology emerges, crypto networks, trustless system where nobody has an advantage. Nobody has to trust each other, that stimulate economies. A reset, a new system is coming. Whether that comes orderly or disorderly is unknown, but it's certain that the new system is coming.
I am deeply skeptical about the capacity of government agencies to be innovative. And it took U.S. Central Bank 5 years to adopt, at least 5 years to adopt cloud technologies after industry had broadly adopted them. And the notion that a government agency is going to be on the forefront of innovating in this space strikes me as highly, highly unlikely.
The world is moving forward. Some nations are way ahead of others. When the laggards need to play catch-up, they will hire the private sector to get them up to speed.
Let's go over the petrodollar and its relationship to what just happened in Afghanistan. It all starts in 1974. The US goes to Saudi Arabia and says, listen, guys, we need to cut a deal. Here's what it's going to look like. We want you to price your oil in dollars. So whomever you sell it to, you could sell it to a Japanese entity or maybe Argentinian entity. You need to require that they pay you in dollars for that barrel of oil. And in return, we're going to give you military protection. So let's think about what this would do for the United States dollar. All of these countries around the globe and entities, corporations that need oil to survive would have to first come up with dollars. Well, that's going to create massive amounts of artificial demand for dollars outside of the United States. If there's artificial demand, this props up the value that allows the United States to run huge deficits, not only budget deficits, but trade deficits, the twin deficits that Jeff Gundlach has been talking about recently. It also allows us to have artificially low interest rates inside the United States. We can spend more money. We can create a welfare and warfare state, and it artificially props up the standard of living. Because those automobiles or those homes, you can get them at a very low monthly rate because of the artificially low interest rates. Stocks, interest rates go down. The PE goes up, therefore the price of most stocks go up. And the cost of goods and services, because we can run such massive trade deficits, we can import a lot of, or most of the goods that we consume in the United States, keeping the prices low. So let's get a visual of how this plays out. We've got your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. Going back to the 1970s, this was Richard Nixon. His good pal, Henry Kissinger. They go down to the Saudi royal family, to a gentleman named Muhammad Mike. Probably not his real name. And they said, listen, we will go ahead and give you all the military support you want, the planes, the bombers, the soldiers, the guns, the tanks with these American flags on them. All you have to do is sell your oil for dollars. So Muhammad Mike has a customer way over here in Japan, we'll say. His name is Miyagi-san. And he says, Miyagi-san, instead of taking those yen that I've been taking for so long, unfortunately now I need you to pay me dollars. So Miyagi-san has to come up with those dollars to get the oil that he needs from Muhammad Mike. Well, he's got a couple different options here. First, he can sell all of these cheap goods to the United States so they can run a huge trade deficit, and he can take those dollars from the American citizens that aren't producing as much as they consume. So they need to import those products that they can't produce or aren't willing to produce here in the United States. So then those dollars would go down to Miyagi-san, and he can use those to buy oil. His other option is to take the yen, go into the FX market, and trade those yen for dollars. Well, that creates more demand for dollars and then more supply of yen. So what does that do to the cross rate between the dollar and the yen? The dollar would go up in value, the yen would go down. This is what artificially props up the United States dollar and allows us to do all these things that we were talking about earlier. Most specifically, run the huge twin deficits, the trade deficit and the budget deficit. So your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam can keep rates artificially lower. They can borrow at a very low rate. Let's just say 1%. This allows them to send out stimmy checks and all of the funny money to the individuals in the real economy so they can consume more than they produce. But let's just think about this. If the cycle were to reverse and interest rates were to go to their natural level, just for the sake of this example, let's say that's 10%, just think about how much less welfare, warfare spending, and how it would decrease the standard of living right here in the United States. But to get a better idea of how this petrodollar system actually works, editor, let's go right to the internet. Okay, this is Investopedia. Through bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia, beginning in 1974, the U.S. managed to influence members of OPEC to standardize the sale of oil in dollars. In return for invoicing oil in dollar denominations, Saudi Arabia and other Arab states secured U.S. influence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, along with U.S. military assistance. Out of this mutually beneficial agreement, the petro system was born. But now let's go over what's happening with the petrodollar system right now, as we speak in 2021, that could have been triggered by the debacle in Afghanistan. Next, we go to an article from BreakingDefense.com from September 1st, 2021, Beirut, when the deputy defense ministers from Russia and Saudi Arabia signed a new military cooperation agreement last week. It served as not just a sign of growth between the two governments, but also as a clear signal from Riyadh, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is willing to diversify its defense, in other words, its military relationships, beyond its longtime focus on the United States. So if it diversifies its defense relationships, it could also be diversifying the amount of oil that it sells in dollars. And this could lead to them abandoning the entire petrodollar system. And let's remember, the catalyst could have been Afghanistan. So what we see now as a result of the debacle in Afghanistan is the Saudis looking elsewhere for their military protection, more specifically, Russia. So if they're going to Russia for their military protection in the future, that means they don't need the military protection that was being provided to them by the United States. But remember, that was part of the deal. That is what incentivized the Saudis to price their oil in dollars in the first place. So if there's no military protection, why on earth would the Saudis continue to price their oil in dollars? Why wouldn't they start pricing it in rubles? And I'm not saying this all falls apart overnight, but this is one step closer to the de-dollarization of the global oil market. And if we're one step closer to the de-dollarization of the global oil market, we are one step closer to the collapse of the petrodollar system, which would make this whole process work in reverse. Now, all of a sudden, Miyagi-san doesn't need dollars. Therefore, he doesn't have to transfer or trade his yen for dollars on the FX market, propping up the dollar and allowing us to have artificially low interest rates, which gives us an artificially high standard of living. So standards of living decrease, interest rates go up, fewer stimmy checks go out to the average Joe. Then Miyagi-san can decide whether or not he wants to sell those goods to the United States. Maybe he wants to export them somewhere else, or maybe they want to consume them right in Japan, in their home country, to get prices down for their consumers. And let's think this through to the next step. If they decided to import fewer goods to the United States, that means that we would need to produce those goods here. That would drive the cost sky high, producing much higher rates of inflation, therefore a collapse of the dollar against goods and services here domestically in the US economy. So the bottom line is, if the petrodollar collapses, the United States dollar could also collapse. Then we have to think through if what happened in Afghanistan was intentional. And I'm not saying that it is. But if you look at what happened, it doesn't make sense. And I'm not the only one with this view. Editor, let's cut to a clip of my recent interview with one of my favorite macro thinkers, Luke Gromen.
the U.S. intelligence establishment knew where the Taliban was. It was preposterous to think that they were surprised at what was happening. There was like only one road in and out. We have satellites covering the place. We knew what's coming, who's coming. What's more, we've known for a long time that the Pakistani government has been funding the Taliban for a long time, back to like 30 years ago. We've known that. The United States government, I didn't realize this, Logan made the point that the United States government gives the Pakistani intelligence services like $3 or $4 billion a year.
Wow.
And they're supporting the Taliban, and we knew they were coming. And so you go and you say, okay, so we know they're coming, but we act like we don't. We have the ability to shut off this dollar system, this dollar system that we can weaponize, that we have weaponized over and over and over. And you hear all the dollar bulls say, we can weaponize this anytime we want. And I agree. I'm the first person to agree. Why didn't we stop remittances out of the United States to Pakistan? It's very easy to do. Go to the SWIFT, shut it off. Why are we giving $3 to $4 billion a year to the Pakistani intelligence services when they're supporting the Taliban? If the story as we're told is true.
Right.
And so the only conclusion you come to is that there's something we're not being told. And there's something very big and foundational, first principle about this whole setup that we're not being told.
So if the way the United States pulled out of Afghanistan was intentional, and I'm not saying it is, I'm just saying we have to think through the probabilities. So if it was intentional, that would lead you to the conclusion that maybe, just maybe, they wanted the Saudis to go to Russia for their military protection. And then the next step, if they wanted that, then you would have to conclude that your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, or the Biden administration, also wanted the Saudis to price their oil in a currency other than the dollar. And then, of course, the next step, if they want those two things, obviously they want the petrodollar system to collapse, which would give a massive, massive tailwind to inflation and could potentially collapse the United States dollar. We're going to be going over a lot more intel just like this, but in order to connect the dots at the end and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, I want you to put one thing in the forefront of your mind. You might even want to write this down. We've got a timeline starting in 1944. What do you think happened in 1944 that is so important to the topic that we're discussing in this video, the petrodollar? Bretton Woods. Then in 1971, we came off the gold standard. Like we said earlier, 1974, we had the petrodollar agreement go into effect. But in the interim, what was established? Something called the IMF. We're going to talk more about that in step number 3. Also an idea from Keynes called Bank Corps, and we had Triffin's dilemma. This is the idea that if we use one country's sovereign currency for the global reserve currency, it will create a house of cards that inevitably, at some point in time, will all come crashing down. Step number 2, the MMT president. And I want to point out that Biden obviously is a president who believes in this philosophy of modern monetary theory, but he just took the reins from Donald Trump. I don't want to let him off the hook. Trump was the original MMT president, but that goes down a completely separate rabbit hole. So we know Joe Biden has adopted the policies of MMT hook, line, and sinker. And a lot of these ideas come from an economist named Stephanie Kelton. And I also want to point out, we'll get back to this momentarily, that AOC has gone on record saying that MMT is fantastic. She has adopted it and she sees it as a way to pay for the Green New Deal. Biden has insinuated this as well. But let's kind of just do a quick review of MMT to make sure we're on the same page. Kelton would argue that the government is a currency issuer. They are not a currency user. So you can't look at the way the real economy works or the way the balance sheet works for a business or the average Joe and Jane, because they're a currency user. So the balance sheet of the government is literally infinite. They can spend as much money as they want. They actually create the dollars and spend them into existence. There is no constraint on government spending whatsoever. So in theory, the government doesn't even need to issue or sell bonds, treasuries. Why? When they could just create the money by spending it into existence. And if they don't need to sell bonds or treasuries to generate revenue, if they have a deficit, then there's no reason whatsoever for them to collect taxes. Why on earth should they collect taxes when the government, according to Kelton, and let's remember that Biden and AOC have adopted these ideas 100%. But why should the government collect taxes when they are a currency issuer? There's no need for them to collect revenue or dollars at all, because they're the ones who create the dollars, again, by spending them into existence. But there is one minor problem that even Stephanie Kelton would admit to. That is consumer price inflation. As most of you can imagine, if the government is spending, making it rain all of these dollars on the real economy, at some point, there's going to be too many dollars for the amount of goods and services, and the prices of the stuff is going to go up. That's a problem. But Kelton has a solution. All we need to do is then tax people an appropriate amount to get those dollars out of the system and back into the government, where they're magically gone. They vanish once they go to the government. So just a crude example here. We've got $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 going into the system. If they see inflation getting out of hand, running hot, then they'll say, oh, we just need to increase taxes a little bit. And if we increase taxes, then we'll pull 3 of those dollars out of the system. So there will only be $5 circulating in the real economy, chasing goods and services. This will create the downward pressure on consumer price inflation and get the genie back into the inflationary bottle. So they think. Whoa, time out. I know a lot of you that are really paying attention right about now are kind of scratching your head and saying, okay, George, I get it, but if Biden and AOC, who is wearing a tax the rich dress, is coming out and saying that they believe wholeheartedly in MMT, that's how they're going to finance the Green New Deal. So if they believe in MMT, and they also believe that inflation is transitory, both of them, Biden and AOC, have come out and said, oh, there's no need to worry about inflation. In fact, you can see Joe Biden is here holding a sign that says no inflation, as is AOC. Now, unfortunately, she is spelling it INNFLASION. Might have to get Miss AOC some spelling lessons. But regardless of the fact that she can't spell inflation, it doesn't get around the fact that she's been preaching that inflation isn't an issue. Well, hold on a minute here. If they believe in MMT, that the government is the issuer of currency, therefore they're never constrained. They don't have to raise money through the selling of bonds and collecting taxes. And the only reason they would need to collect taxes or increase taxes on the rich is if we had inflation. Then how can they argue that we need to increase taxes on the rich? Those three ideas cannot coexist if you're being intellectually honest. So what does that mean? It means that Biden and AOC and anyone else that believes in MMT and doesn't believe that we have an inflation problem and is arguing that we need to increase taxes on the rich doesn't care about the poor at all. That's not why they're saying tax the rich. They're not saying tax the rich to help the poor. The only objective they have is just to hurt the rich. So I think both Biden and AOC at best are being disingenuous. And more accurately, I think they're just a fraud. They're sitting here telling you that they want to help the poor, but they just want to hurt the rich and further their own political career by trying to pander to their constituents because they think you are too stupid to connect the dots between MMT, inflation, and increasing taxes on the rich. Now let's go back to MMT's fatal flaw. Got a chart here starting at 1945 going all the way to 2014. On the left, we have the percentage of tax revenue to GDP. So if GDP is $100, let's say, and the government collects $20 in taxes, that would be 20% of GDP collected in tax revenue. So that's what this chart is illustrating. And editor, go ahead and throw up the actual chart. You can see it kind of goes up and down, but I just drew this blue line to give us an average of about 18%. So let's think this through. Going back to 1945, the 50s, the 60s, tax rates on the rich were extremely high, upwards of 90%. And then in the 1980s, let's call it right around here, rates went all the way down to maybe 25 or 30%. So regardless of whether the top rate was 90% or 25%, what happened to tax revenue as a percentage of GDP? It doesn't really change at all. So if the amount of dollars that are being sucked out of the system by tax collection are very consistent, then how would the MMTers propose that they suck those dollars out of the system if inflation starts to run hot? Let's go over this one more time to make sure we're all on the same page. Kelton, Biden, and AOC believe that the government can create as much money as it wants. And the only constraint is inflation. And if they see inflation, they can just increase tax rates on the rich that will suck dollars out of the system and put downward pressure on consumer price inflation. But what history shows us is that regardless of where the tax rates are, they can be at 90%, they can be at 25%, the government still collects the same amount of money as a percentage of GDP. And if the government is collecting the same amount of dollars, it's pulling the same amount of dollars out of the system, regardless of what that highest marginal rate would be. Therefore, just by increasing the marginal rate doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be pulling more dollars out of the system. So if you can't pull more dollars out of the system, then there's absolutely no way for the MMTers to fight inflation. This brings us to another tailwind for the collapse of the dollar based on Biden's policies of the twin deficit. His policies of massive deficit spending, in addition to creating an environment in the United States where we have to import more and more goods from other countries because we're not producing them here, taking our trade deficit to all-time highs. This is a textbook recipe for collapsing a currency. Step number 3, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and Biden. Let's go over the connection. In step number 1, we talked about how Biden, whether it's intentional or unintentional, could be destroying the petrodollar. In step number 2, we talked about how he is an MMT president. There's no disputing that. He's running massive budget deficits and also trade deficits, giving a huge tailwind to inflationary pressures that could collapse the dollar. But these attacks on the dollar are just the beginning. Let's remember that Biden has recently come out with a cerveza sickness plan. And I don't want to go over the whole entire plan, but let's go over the first talking point. And I got to keep this YouTube friendly. So it requires, or has a certain requirement for businesses over 100 employees. I think you guys know exactly what I'm referring to. But let's remember that he's introducing these requirements in a very tight labor market. What I mean by that is very few times in American history have employers been more in need of employees than right now. The last number that came out, if my memory serves me right, an editor helped me out with this one, about 11 million job openings in the United States right now. So let's think this through. What he's doing is reducing the labor pool by creating an additional requirement for businesses. Right here we have business XYZ, and as you can tell, they've got a help wanted sign right in the front. And the entrepreneur involved is Job Creator Joe, probably the cousin of the average Joe. There are a lot fewer Job Creator Joes, unfortunately, than there are average Joes. But the government comes in and says, listen, Job Creator Joe, you need to give all of your employees this required stuff. We'll call it. And Joe says, oh my gosh, I already don't have enough employees. How can I afford to lose some of the great employees I already have? Let's say he started off with 3 employees, or maybe 300 would be a better example, because the requirement as of right now is 100. But Job Creator Joe is definitely going to have some employees that don't want to go along with the requirement. So he starts with 300 employees, but now let's say he only has 200 employees, but he originally had a need for 400 employees. That's why he had the help wanted sign in the first place. So what is he going to do initially? He's going to increase wages to try to bring in those employees who are currently unemployed. But unfortunately, contrary to popular belief out there in the mainstream media, businesses don't have infinite margins. So let's just say Job Creator Joe is running at a 10% margin. Well, usually 40% of your overall expenses will be payroll. So how is he going to afford to increase wages to a significant degree if he only has a 10% margin? Because at some point in time, there isn't going to be any margin left over. Then he's only going to have one option and one option only. That is to increase prices. So when you combine this with all the other inflationary pressures we've been talking about, that's going to take consumer prices to infinity and beyond. They're going Buzz Lightyear. And this, of course, is going to give another tailwind to the dollar collapsing in value relative to those goods and services. But let's go back to the title of this video. Is Biden intentionally trying to collapse the dollar? It's not Biden is trying to collapse the dollar. So I have to answer the question. And if you had to put me on the spot right now, my answer to you, the viewers watching this video, would be no. I do not think that Biden is intentionally trying to collapse the dollar. Why? Because even if he wanted to, I don't think he's smart enough. And this is really the key. To understand what I'm talking about, editor, let's go right to the internet. This blog post is on the World Economic Forum's website. It's titled, "A Digital Currency Should Be Adopted as the World's Leading Reserve Currency." In other words, replace the US dollar. I also want to point out, before we move any further, that the URL that the World Economic Forum came up with is from dollar to E-SDR. And I've read so many of their articles, and what I've noticed is a lot of times they'll come up with a title that's like from the dollar to the E-SDR that is extremely unpopular, and they'll get a lot of pushback and negative press, especially on social media and YouTube, and then they'll change the title of the blog post or the article, but you usually see the original in the URL. Just FYI when you're doing your own research. In step number 1, we talked about Triffin's dilemma. Basically, this states that if there is one country that has the global reserve currency, it is totally unsustainable. So in this blog post, they reference Triffin's dilemma as a reason why the dollar should not be the global reserve currency. Here we go. Of course, Triffin's dilemma can be avoided, and America's outsized influence over the monetary system reduced. All that is needed is a major reserve currency that is not issued by a national authority. And I know a lot of you watching right now will get a kick out of this next sentence. Gold once supposed to fill this role, but it couldn't meet demand for global liquidity and a store of value. How on earth can they argue that gold could not fill the role of being a store of value? Unbelievable. But let's get back on track. So if they're saying the dollar can no longer be the world reserve currency and gold just won't work, what do they suggest? Well, here we go. A better option is the IMF's special drawing right, the SDR. But let's think about this for a moment. They're talking about how they need to get rid of the dollar because America has outsized influence over the monetary system. And if it has outsized influence over the monetary system, it has outsized influence over the entire world. But they are wanting that outsized influence to go from the United States to the IMF. And as you know, the IMF and the World Economic Forum are basically tied at the hip. So remember, at the beginning of the video, I went over this small timeline, 1944 to 1974. And I told you to write down 3 things. IMF, Bancor, which turned out to be what? SDRs, special drawing right, the currency of the IMF, and Triffin's dilemma. What I illustrated in the reading is part of their argument for abandoning the dollar as the world reserve currency is because of Triffin's dilemma. But I think it's also because of control and power that it gives the central planners. So we've got Klaus Schwab right here in charge of the World Economic Forum, everyone's favorite organization. And he's got his cat, Mr. Bigglesworth. So he is saying dollar is bad. SDR is good. It's exactly what they are saying in that blog post that we read from the World Economic Forum. But let's think this through. We realize the central planners want to replace the United States dollar with a digital SDR. But let's go back to the exorbitant privilege the dollar gave the United States. That's what we were referencing in step number 1 earlier in the video. So if the global reserve currency goes from the United States to the IMF and the World Economic Forum, and I'm putting them together because basically they're tied at the hip, very similar to our federal government and Goldman Sachs. But if the world reserve currency goes from the United States to the central planners at the IMF and the World Economic Forum, so is all of the power, control, and global dominance. So I think there is a possibility. And again, there are no certainties. There are only probabilities. But I think the probability is far higher than 0 that Biden is simply a puppet. He's a useful idiot. And the people who are really pulling the strings to get the power, the control, and the global dominance are the central planners at the IMF and the World Economic Forum. Is this their intent? I don't know. Maybe. But do they have an incentive? Absolutely. And as Charlie Munger famously said, show me the incentives and I will show you the outcome.